The slam of the door was the final note of Fiona's humiliation. Matilda Vale's laughter, sharp and triumphant, cut through the quiet street like a whip crack. Fiona clutched Scout tighter, feeling the weight of her entire world collapse into this single, brutal moment, cast out with nothing but a puppy and the clothes on her back. Then the carriage stopped. Julian Ashford, the Duke of Ravenhall, descended from his black lacquered coach. His dark eyes swept past the sneering stepmother in the window, past the indifferent servants closing the shutters, and landed on the trembling puppy in Fiona's arms. The small dog wriggled free. Scout bounded straight toward the Duke, not with fear, but with inexplicable joy, and leaped into his arms as if he'd found home itself. Julian caught the creature instinctively, and for the first time in years, something in his carefully controlled expression softened. The puppy licked his face, tail wagging furiously, then turned and whined, pulling at the Duke's coat toward the weeping girl on the curb. The Duke's gaze finally lifted to Fiona's. "You," he said quietly, his voice carrying a strange gentleness that made the street feel less cold. "Should not be here. Neither should he." He extended his hand. "Come with me, both of you." The world seemed to hold its breath. But what does this unexpected intervention truly mean? Is Fiona being rescued by a compassionate stranger, or has fate simply delivered her to a different kind of prison? And why does the formidable Duke of Ravenhall, a man known for his icy reserve, show such immediate tenderness toward one scruffy little dog? My beautiful family. It is the Victorian Royal Stories team again. Before we move into this story, I'd love you to subscribe to this channel. It helps me bring you more tales of second chances and unexpected love. Also, like and share this video. Someone out there needs it. Let me know in the comments. Team Duke or Team Scout? And tell me where you are watching from. The door to Fiona's former home locked with a final, echoing click. Fiona stared at the Duke's outstretched hand as if it were an apparition. Her breath came in shallow, broken gasps. The cobblestones beneath her were damp and cold, seeping through her thin dress. And somewhere in the recesses of her shattered mind, she registered that she had nowhere else to go. No family. No friends brave enough to shelter Matilda Vale's disgraced stepdaughter. No money for even a single night's lodging. Just Scout. And now, impossibly, this stranger. I cannot impose upon your grace," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I have nothing. I am nothing." Julian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those winter-dark eyes. Scout, still cradled against the Duke's chest, barked once, a sharp, insistent sound, and pawed at Julian's coat as if scolding him for the delay. The corner of the Duke's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Almost. "Your companion disagrees," Julian said, his tone dry but not unkind. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself level with Fiona's hunched form on the curb. The movement was so unexpected, so utterly improper for a man of his rank, that Fiona's tears stopped from sheer shock. Scout wriggled in the Duke's arms, straining toward Fiona with desperate little whines. Julian released him, and the puppy immediately threw himself at Fiona, licking her face, her hands, her tear-stained cheeks with frantic devotion. "He loves you," Julian observed quietly. "And animals, Miss Linden, are far better judges of character than most of society. If this creature believes you worthy of such loyalty—" He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Then I am inclined to trust his judgment. You know my name?" The question escaped before Fiona could stop it. "I make it my business to know the people in my district. Your father was a good man. His passing was a loss." Julian stood, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. What happened after is a disgrace that reflects solely on those who perpetrated it. Fiona's throat tightened. When had anyone last defended her father's memory? When had anyone suggested that Matilda's treatment of her was wrong, rather than deserved? Above them, a window scraped open. Matilda's voice drifted down, honeyed with false concern. "Your Grace, I do apologize for the disturbance. The girl has always been prone to theatrics. She'll move along shortly, I'm sure." Julian didn't even glance up. "Mrs. Vale," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the darkening street, "I suggest you close your window. The matter is no longer your concern." The window slammed shut with enough force to rattle the frame. Scout barked triumphantly. Despite everything, Fiona felt the smallest, most fragile bubble of something like hope rise in her chest. The Duke extended his hand again, and this time there was no question in the gesture. Only patient, unyielding certainty. "Ravenhall has more than enough room," Julian said. "You will be my guest until we determine a more permanent arrangement. Your dog is welcome. In fact, I insist upon it. I have been told I am in desperate need of better company than my steward and the gardener. I don't understand why you would, because it is right." The words were simple, absolute. "And because Scout has decided, and I have learned to trust the wisdom of small creatures with large hearts." He glanced at the puppy, who was now sitting at Fiona's feet, tail thumping against the cobblestones, looking enormously pleased with himself. He knew where to find help. Perhaps you should trust him as well. Fiona looked down at Scout, at his bright, confident eyes. The puppy barked once more, then placed his small paw on her knee. "Trust him," that gesture seemed to say. "Trust me. Trust this." Slowly, shakily, Fiona placed her cold hand in the Duke's warm one. Julian's fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, and he drew her to her feet as if she weighed nothing at all. Scout immediately danced around their ankles, yipping with joy, as if he'd personally orchestrated the entire rescue. Perhaps he had. "Come," Julian said softly, guiding her toward the carriage where a wide-eyed footman held the door open. "You've been cold long enough." As Fiona stepped into the warm, velvet-lined interior, Scout leaping in beside her, she caught one final glimpse of the house that had been her prison. Matilda's silhouette stood rigid behind the curtains, watching. For the first time in 3 years, Fiona didn't feel afraid. The carriage door closed, and the Duke of Ravenhall carried her away into the night, toward a future she couldn't yet imagine, guided by nothing more than the pure, inexplicable trust of one very determined puppy. Ravenhall rose from the darkness like something out of a fever dream. Fiona pressed her face to the carriage window, her breath fogging the glass as the estate materialized through the trees. Torches lined the sweeping drive, casting golden light across pale stone walls that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Towers pierced the night sky. Gardens sprawled in geometric precision, even in the dimness. It was a palace, not a home, and the sight of it made her stomach clench with fresh panic. What had she done? What had she agreed to? Scout, curled in her lap, lifted his head and licked her hand, as if sensing her spiraling thoughts. Across from her, the Duke sat in perfect stillness, his expression unreadable in the shadowed interior. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the city, and Fiona had been too terrified to break the silence. Now, as the carriage rolled to a stop before the magnificent entrance, Julian finally stirred. "Mrs. Pembroke will see you settled," he said quietly. "She is the housekeeper and has managed Ravenhall since before I inherited. You may trust her completely." He paused, his gaze dropping to Scout. The kitchens will have something suitable for your companion. He looks half-starved. He ate my breakfast this morning, Fiona whispered. I wasn't very hungry. Something flickered across Julian's face. Anger, perhaps, or pain. But it vanished before she could name it. That will not happen here, he said, and there was steel beneath the gentleness. Neither of you will go hungry at Ravenhall. That is my promise. The footman opened the door, and Julian descended first, turning to offer his hand. Fiona took it, clutching Scout against her chest with the other arm, and stepped down onto gravel that crunched beneath her worn shoes. The entrance hall stole what little breath she had left. Marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers dripping with crystal. A grand staircase swept upward, its balustrade carved with such intricate detail it looked like frozen lace. Portraits lined the walls, generations of aristocratic faces staring down with varying degrees of hauteur. Fiona felt their painted eyes judging her, finding her wanting, wondering what this bedraggled creature was doing in their ancestral home. Miss Linden? She jumped. A woman had appeared as if from nowhere, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, with the kind of posture that suggested she'd never slouched a day in her life. But her eyes, sharp and assessing, weren't unkind. Mrs. Pembroke, Julian said. This is Miss Fiona Linden. She will be our guest for the foreseeable future. Please prepare the rose room and ensure she has everything she requires. Mrs. Pembroke's gaze traveled from Fiona's tear-stained face to her muddy hem to the puppy in her arms. If she felt shock or disapproval, she hid it masterfully. Of course, Your Grace. Miss Linden, if you'll follow me. Wait. Julian's voice stopped them. He crossed to Fiona, and for a moment, she thought he might touch her shoulder, offer some gesture of comfort. Instead, he addressed Scout, reaching out to scratch behind the puppy's ears. Scout's tail wagged so hard, his entire body wiggled. You did well tonight, Julian murmured to the dog. Then, finally, his eyes lifted to Fiona's. You are safe here. I know you have no reason to believe that, but it is true. Tomorrow we'll discuss your situation properly. For tonight, simply rest. He stepped back, nodded to Mrs. Pembroke, and walked away down a corridor without looking back. Fiona watched him disappear, feeling suddenly unmoored. This way, miss, Mrs. Pembroke said, not unkindly. The rose room was named for the silk wallpaper, pale pink with cream accents that covered the walls. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, its curtains tied back with golden cord. A fire already crackled in the hearth. There was a writing desk, a wardrobe that could have held a dozen wardrobes worth of clothing, and a window seat overlooking gardens she couldn't see in the darkness. It was larger than the room she'd shared with her father, larger than any space Matilda had ever allowed her. A bath is being drawn, Mrs. Pembroke said, moving efficiently around the room. I've sent for a tray, nothing heavy, just some broth and bread. The Duke mentioned your companion would need feeding as well. I don't know how to repay this, Fiona said, her voice breaking. Any of this. I don't know what he expects. His Grace expects nothing. Mrs. Pembroke's tone was firm. He is many things, Miss Linden, but he is not a man who trades charity for obligation. If he has offered you sanctuary, he means it without condition. She paused at the door. Though I will say, in the 15 years I have served this household, I have never seen him smile at anything the way he smiled at that dog of yours. After she left, Fiona sank onto the edge of the bed, still holding Scout. The puppy squirmed free and immediately began exploring, sniffing every corner, his nails clicking on the polished floor. Safe. The Duke had said she was safe, but Fiona had learned not to trust safety. It was a mirage that vanished the moment you reached for it. Her father had made her feel safe, and then he died. The solicitor had assured her Matilda would honor her father's wishes, and that had been a lie. Safety was something that happened to other people, people who deserved it. A knock at the door made her flinch. A maid entered with a tray, followed by another with a copper tub, followed by several more with steaming buckets of water. They worked in synchronized silence, preparing the bath, laying out the food, placing a small bowl of scraps near the hearth for Scout. When they left, Fiona approached the tray with trembling hands. Broth still steaming, fresh bread with butter, sliced apples, a pot of tea. She burst into tears. Scout trotted over, whining, and she lifted him into her lap, burying her face in his soft fur. "What have you gotten us into?" she whispered. But even as she said it, even as doubt gnawed at her, she couldn't deny the warmth of the room, the softness of the bed at her back, the smell of food she hadn't had to beg for. Far below, in another wing of the vast house, Julian stood at his study window, staring out at nothing. His steward, Collins, cleared his throat delicately. "The staff is already talking, Your Grace. By morning, half of London will know you've taken in a young woman of no family." "Let them talk," Julian said quietly. "They will say, I know what they will say, Collins. I don't care." He turned from the window, his expression hard. "Prepare a letter to my solicitor. I want a full accounting of Mrs. Matilda Vale's finances and legal standing. Everything." Collins hesitated. "May I ask why, Your Grace?" Julian's jaw tightened. "Because I do not like bullies, and I particularly do not like bullies who make young women cry on street corners." He paused. "Also, inform the kitchen that will require additional provisions. The dog will need proper meals." "The dog, Your Grace?" For the first time that evening, Julian smiled. It was small, barely there, but genuine. "Yes, Collins. The dog. He has excellent taste in people. I intend to keep him happy." After Collins left, Julian returned to the window. Somewhere above him, in the Rose Room, Fiona Linden was probably terrified, probably convinced this was temporary, probably waiting for the other shoe to drop. She wasn't wrong to be cautious. The world had taught her that kindness was conditional. But Julian was a patient man, and he had learned, long ago, that the creatures most worth saving were the ones who'd forgotten they deserved to be saved at all. Scout had known. The moment that little dog had looked at Fiona, then at Julian, the message had been clear. Fix this. Help her. And Julian had never been able to ignore an animal in need. He suspected, though he wouldn't admit it yet, that he was even less able to ignore the woman who loved that animal with such desperate, pure devotion. Outside, the first whispers were already beginning their journey through London's drawing rooms, carried by servants and gossips and the endlessly curious. The Duke of Ravenhall has taken in a woman, a nobody, a scandal. Let them whisper. Julian had never cared much for society's opinions anyway. Scout had appointed himself the architect of their days. Fiona discovered this on her third morning at Ravenhall. When the puppy abandoned his comfortable position on her bed, trotted to the door, and began scratching insistently until she followed. He led her down the grand staircase, through corridors she hadn't yet explored, past bemused servants who stepped aside with knowing smiles, and directly into the conservatory, where the Duke sat reading beside a fountain. Julian looked up from his book, surprise flickering across his features. Scout bounded over to him, tail wagging furiously, then ran back to Fiona, then back to the Duke, as if physically tying them together with invisible thread. "I'm so sorry," Fiona stammered, already backing toward the door. I didn't mean to intrude on your morning." "You're not intruding." Julian set his book aside, watching Scout with what might have been amusement. "I think we've been summoned. He seems quite insistent." Scout barked once, sharp and pleased, then settled himself exactly between them. That became the pattern. Every morning, Scout would lead Fiona somewhere in the vast estate, the library, the gardens, the music room, and inevitably, Julian would already be there. Or he would arrive moments later, as if he too had been summoned by some invisible command only the puppy could issue. "He's remarkably intelligent," Julian observed one afternoon as they walked the garden paths, Scout trotting ahead to investigate every flowering bush. Or remarkably manipulative, I haven't decided which. Fiona smiled, the expression still feeling strange on her face after so many months of Matilda's house. "Perhaps both. My father used to say that small dogs have twice the personality to compensate for their size." "Your father was wise." Julian paused beside a rose arbor, his hands clasped behind his back. "You speak of him with great affection." "He was everything." The words came quietly. "Kind, patient. He never made me feel like I was too much or not enough. After my mother died, he could have sent me away to school, focused on his work, but he didn't. He taught me himself, Latin and history, and how to recognize bird calls." She swallowed hard. "I miss him every day." Julian was silent for a long moment, watching Scout dig enthusiastically at the base of a statue. "My father died when I was 12, he said finally. I barely knew him. He was always in London, always at Parliament or his club. I was raised by tutors and then sent away. I inherited at 19 and realized I had been given an entire dukedom, but no idea what a home actually felt like." Fiona turned to look at him, startled by the admission, the Duke of Ravenhall, standing in his magnificent gardens, looking suddenly very alone. "Is that why you live here instead of London?" she asked softly. "I live here because the house is too large for ghosts to fill it completely. And because—" He hesitated, then gestured toward the grounds. "Because I wanted to understand what my father never did. That land and title mean nothing if there's no warmth in them. No life." His gaze shifted to Scout, who had given up digging and was now rolling enthusiastically in a patch of clover. "No joy." Scout sneezed, shook himself, and trotted back to them, looking enormously satisfied with his dirt-covered state. "He's going to need a bath," Fiona said, trying not to laugh. "He's going to need several baths, at the rate he's going." Julian crouched down, and Scout immediately climbed into his lap, spreading mud liberally across the Duke's perfectly pressed trousers. Julian didn't seem to notice or care. He scratched behind the puppy's ears, his expression softening in that way Fiona had begun to recognize, the way his carefully maintained reserve crumbled in the presence of this small, joyful creature. "You're wonderful with him," she said before she could stop herself. Julian glanced up, and for a moment their eyes met. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. The acknowledgement that they were both people who had learned to live with loneliness, who had built walls so high they'd forgotten what it felt like when someone tried to climb them. "I've always preferred animals to people," Julian admitted. "They're honest. They don't perform or pretend. When Scout looks at me, he doesn't see a duke or a title. He sees someone who might have food in his pocket." "That's not true." Fiona sat down on the grass beside them, propriety forgotten. "He sees someone kind, someone safe. Dogs know these things." "And what do you see, Miss Linden?" The question caught her off guard. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the Duke who had stopped his carriage for a crying girl, who had opened his home without hesitation, who spent his mornings reading in conservatories, waiting to be found by an insistent puppy. "I see someone lonely," she said honestly. "Like me." Julian's hand stilled on Scout's fur. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then so quietly she almost missed it. "Yes." Scout, sensing the shift in mood, wriggled free and placed one muddy paw on Fiona's knee and one on Julian's, forcing them to lean slightly closer to keep him balanced. He looked between them, tail wagging, as if very pleased with his arrangement. "He's doing it again," Julian observed. "Doing what?" "Building bridges." The corner of Julian's mouth lifted. "I think he's decided we need each other." "Do we?" The words escaped before Fiona could call them back. Julian was quiet, studying her with those dark, careful eyes. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have spent a very long time in this house convincing myself that solitude was preferable to the alternative, that people were complicated and exhausting, and that I was better off with my books and my gardens and my routines." He paused. "And then, a small dog led me to someone who understands exactly why I built those walls in the first place." Fiona's throat tightened. "Your Grace, Julian." The correction was gentle. "When it's just us and the extremely muddy mediator between us, I would prefer Julian." "Julian," she repeated, testing the shape of his name. It felt dangerously intimate. "I don't know how long I can stay here. People are already talking. Mrs. Pembroke mentioned that there were questions in town." "Let them question." His voice hardened slightly. "You are under my protection. That means something. But what happens when the questions become accusations? When my presence here damages your reputation?" "Fiona." Her name in his voice stopped her spiraling thoughts. "I did not offer you sanctuary because it was convenient or proper. I offered it because it was right. And because—" He looked down at Scout, who had fallen asleep across both their laps, mud and all. "Because I suspect that little creature knows something I'm only beginning to understand." "What's that?" Julian met her eyes again, and this time he didn't look away. "That some rescues go both directions." The afternoon sun slanted through the rose arbor, casting patterns of light and shadow across the three of them: the Duke, the displaced girl, and the puppy who had decided they belonged together. In the distance, a servant appeared on the terrace, then discreetly retreated. The gossip would spread, Fiona knew. The Duke and Miss Linden, sitting together in the garden, close enough to touch, with a sleeping dog between them, like a chaperone who had fallen down on the job. But here, in this moment, she couldn't bring herself to care. "Tell me about the birds," Julian said quietly. "The ones your father taught you to recognize." So she did, and he listened. And Scout slept on, entirely satisfied with his work. The letter arrived during breakfast. Julian recognized his cousin's handwriting immediately. Beatrice never could resist inserting herself into his affairs, especially when gossip was involved. He set down his coffee and broke the seal, scanning the contents with growing coldness. "Dearest Julian, I feel it my duty to inform you that certain questions are being raised about your house guest. Mrs. Vale has been quite vocal in town about Miss Linden's unfortunate history. Something about an incident in Bath 2 years ago involving a gentleman of questionable character. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. But you know how people talk. Do be careful. Your reputation is not as unassailable as you might think. With affection, B." He read it twice, then set it aside as Fiona entered the breakfast room, Scout trotting at her heels. She'd grown more comfortable these past 2 weeks. The permanent tension had eased from her shoulders, and she smiled more readily. Seeing her now, watching her greet the puppy with such unguarded affection, Julian felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest. He needed to know. Not because he doubted her, but because whatever Matilda was spreading through London's drawing rooms would eventually reach Ravenhall's doors, and he would not let Fiona be blindsided by malicious whispers. "Good morning," Fiona said, her smile dimming slightly when she saw his expression. "Is something wrong?" Julian folded the letter deliberately. "I received correspondence from my cousin. She mentioned that there have been rumors about your time in Bath." The color drained from Fiona's face. Her hand dropped from Scout's head, and the puppy whined, sensing her distress immediately. "I see." Her voice had gone hollow. Matilda didn't waste any time. "Fiona, you want me to leave?" She stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. "Of course, I understand. I'll pack my things immediately. I should never have—" "Sit down." Julian's voice was gentle but firm. "Please." She remained standing, trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor. Scout pawed at her skirt, confused and upset by her sudden change in demeanor. Julian rose and crossed to her slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "I am not asking you to leave. I am asking you to trust me with the truth. Whatever it is, whatever happened, I would prefer to hear it from you, rather than from gossips who have already decided how to shape the narrative. You don't understand what you're asking? Then help me understand." Fiona's breath came in shallow gasps. For a moment, Julian thought she might bolt from the room entirely. Then, slowly, she sank back into her chair, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles went white. Scout immediately jumped into her lap, and she clutched him like a lifeline. "I was 17, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father had just died. Matilda had married him only 6 months before his passing. And suddenly she controlled everything. The house, the finances, me. She decided I needed to be introduced to society. Said it was her duty as my stepmother to see me properly settled." Julian returned to his seat but said nothing, simply listening. "She took me to Bath for the season. I was so lost, Julian. Grieving and confused and desperate for anyone to show me a shred of kindness." Her voice cracked. "There was a man, Captain Hendricks. He was charming and attentive, and he seemed to genuinely care about what I thought, what I felt. Matilda encouraged the acquaintance, pushed us together at every opportunity." She paused, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Scout licked her hand, whimpering. "He invited me to walk in the Sydney Gardens one evening. Matilda said it was perfectly appropriate, that her maid would chaperone. But when we arrived..." Fiona's breath hitched. The maid conveniently disappeared, and Captain Hendricks suggested we take a more private path. I was stupid enough to agree. Julian's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. He tried to kiss me, more than kiss me. I pushed him away, but he didn't stop immediately. I had to fight him off, Julian. Actually fight. I tore his coat, scratched his face. When I finally broke free and ran, I was disheveled and crying, and half of Bath society saw me stumbling out of those gardens alone. Her hands shook violently now. Matilda was waiting at the entrance. She looked at me with such satisfaction, such triumph. She'd planned it all, you see. The missing chaperone, the chance encounter with witnesses. Captain Hendricks spread the story that I had lured him into the gardens, that I had behaved wantonly and then created a scene when he rejected my advances. That's a damned lie. The words came out harder than Julian intended. Fiona flinched. Is it? I was the one who agreed to walk with him. I was the one who went down that path. I should have known better. Should have been more careful. Matilda made sure everyone knew that I had shamed the family, that I was fortunate she didn't cast me out immediately. She looked up at Julian finally, her eyes red and devastated. So you see, the rumors aren't entirely wrong. I was involved in a scandal. I did damage my reputation. And now, I've brought that shame into your house. The silence that followed felt crushing. Julian stood slowly and crossed to the sideboard, pouring a glass of water. He brought it to Fiona, pressing it gently into her shaking hands. Drink, he said quietly. She obeyed mechanically. He crouched beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. Scout, still in her lap, reached out and licked Julian's hand, as if trying to bridge the gap between them. Fiona, look at me. She did, reluctantly. You were 17 years old, newly orphaned, and manipulated by someone who should have protected you. A predator targeted you with the help of the woman who was supposed to be your guardian. You defended yourself. You escaped. His voice was steel wrapped in silk. There is no shame in any of that. None. Do you understand me? But the gossip. The gossip is the weapon of small-minded people who mistake cruelty for entertainment. I don't care what Bath Society thinks happened. I care about the truth. And the truth is that you were wronged. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her clenched hands with his own. The truth is that you survived something designed to break you, and you came out the other side still capable of kindness, still capable of loving this ridiculous puppy with your whole heart. A sob broke free from Fiona's chest. I thought you would send me away, she whispered. I thought once you knew, you would realize I wasn't worth the trouble. Julian's grip on her hands tightened. Then you thought wrong. He paused, weighing his next words carefully, knowing they would change everything between them. Fiona, I have spent 2 weeks watching you heal in this house, watching you smile again, watching you play with Scout in the gardens and read in the library and slowly remember what it feels like to be safe. If you think I would trade that for the good opinion of people who believe Matilda Vale's poison, then you don't know me at all. Why? The word was raw, desperate. Why do you care so much? He should have had an answer prepared. Something logical, appropriate, befitting a duke offering charity to a young woman in need. But the truth came out instead, unpolished and startlingly honest. Because somewhere between Scout dragging me to you on that curb and watching you laugh at his antics this morning, I stopped seeing you as a responsibility and started seeing you as... He hesitated, then committed. As someone I cannot imagine this house without, someone who makes even the library feel less lonely, someone I find myself looking for in every room I enter. Fiona's breath caught. Julian. I am not asking for anything, he said quickly. I'm simply telling you that whatever Matilda spreads, whatever society whispers, you are not facing it alone. And you are not facing it ashamed. Because I know the truth now. And the truth only makes me more certain that giving you sanctuary was the best decision I've made in years. Scout, apparently deciding the emotional tenor had improved sufficiently, barked once and wagged his tail. Fiona laughed through her tears, the sound wet and broken, but genuine. He's very pleased with himself. He should be. He's an excellent judge of character. Julian stood, still holding her gaze. Will you stay? Even knowing that the rumors will likely get worse before they get better? She looked at him for a long moment. This Duke who had knelt beside her chair, who had listened without judgment, who had somehow made her feel worthy despite everything. Yes, she whispered, if you'll have me. Always, Julian said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in his careful, guarded life. Outside, the first autumn leaves were beginning to fall, and in London, Matilda Vale was already composing her next letter, sharpening her next weapon. But in the breakfast room at Ravenhall, a girl who had been taught she was broken was learning what it felt like to be seen as whole. The invitation to Lady Ashford's autumn gala arrived with all the weight of a declaration of war. Julian held the cream-colored card between his fingers, reading the elegant script with a slight smile. His aunt, his father's sister, was many things, but subtle was not among them. The postscript made her intentions clear. Do bring your house guest, nephew. I'm dying to meet her. Translation: all of London was dying to see the mysterious Miss Linden who had taken up residence at Ravenhall, and his aunt had decided to provide them with a stage. You don't have to do this, Fiona said from across the drawing room, where she sat with Scout curled beside her. She'd been reading, but the book lay forgotten in her lap now, her expression anxious. I know what this is, a test. They want to see if I'm worthy of your protection. They can want whatever they like. Julian set the invitation aside. What matters is that you are ready to face them, not as some supplicant begging for acceptance, but as my guest. There's a difference. Is there? Her voice was small. Julian, these are people who have already heard Matilda's version of events. They've decided who I am before they've even met me. Then we'll give them reason to reconsider their conclusions. He crossed to her, Scout immediately perking up at his approach. Fiona, if we hide here at Ravenhall, the rumors will only fester and grow. But if we face them directly, if you walk into that ballroom on my arm— He paused, choosing his words carefully. It sends a message that you have nothing to hide and everything to lose by their judgment. It shows strength. I don't feel strong. You survived Matilda Vale's household for 3 years. You fought off a predator in Sydney Gardens. You're stronger than you know. He offered his hand, and you won't be alone. I'll be beside you the entire evening. She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then placed hers in it. Scout barked approvingly. He thinks it's a good idea, Julian observed. He thinks everything is a good idea if it involves people paying attention to him, Fiona said, but she was almost smiling. The modiste arrived 2 days later with enough fabric swatches to outfit a small army. Julian had been quite specific in his instructions. The dress should be elegant, but not ostentatious, sophisticated, but age-appropriate, and in a color that would make Miss Linden look like she belonged in a ballroom, not like she was trying too hard to get there. The result, when Fiona descended the stairs the evening of the gala, made Julian forget how to breathe. The gown was a soft blue-gray, like twilight, with delicate silver embroidery along the bodice. Her dark hair had been dressed simply, with just a few pearl pins catching the light. She looked beautiful, yes, but more than that, she looked like herself. Not a girl playing dress-up in borrowed finery, but a young woman who had every right to walk into that ballroom and demand to be seen. Will I do? She asked nervously, smoothing her skirts. You'll do more than that, Julian said, offering his arm. You'll make them regret every rumor they ever entertained." Scout, who had been outfitted with a new collar for the occasion despite not being invited, trotted after them to the door, whining pitifully when he realized he was being left behind. "Guard the house," Julian told him seriously. "We're counting on you." The puppy sat, tail thumping, looking entirely too pleased with his assignment. Lady Ashford's ballroom glittered with candlelight and malice in equal measure. Julian felt the shift in atmosphere the moment they were announced. Conversations didn't stop. That would have been too obvious. But they quieted, sharpened, refocused. Eyes tracked their progress across the room with the precision of hawks spotting prey. Fiona's hand tightened on his arm. "Breathe," he murmured. "And remember, half these people are desperately dull. Their opinions matter less than Scout's." That startled a small laugh from her, and several nearby matrons looked scandalized that she dared to appear amused. Lady Ashford descended upon them immediately, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Fiona's appearance, with the efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield. "Julian, darling. And this must be the famous Miss Linden." Her smile was all teeth. "How lovely that you could join us. I understand you've been quite the recluse at Ravenhall." "Miss Linden has been recovering from a difficult period," Julian said smoothly. "I thought a change of scenery would do her good." "How charitable of you." Lady Ashford's gaze didn't leave Fiona. "Tell me, my dear, how are you finding the country? So quiet after Bath, I imagine." The mention of Bath was deliberate, a test. Fiona lifted her chin slightly. "I find the country far more honest than Bath ever was, Lady Ashford. The air is cleaner." Something flickered in his aunt's eyes, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect. "Indeed. Well, do enjoy the evening. I'm sure you'll find no shortage of people eager to make your acquaintance." As she swept away, Julian leaned down slightly. "Well done. I think I just insulted half the guests. You were diplomatic and dignified. It's not your fault if they choose to take offense." They had made it perhaps 20 feet further into the ballroom when the crowd parted, and Matilda Vale stepped into view. Julian felt Fiona freeze beside him. Matilda looked resplendent in deep purple silk, dripping with jewels that had likely belonged to Fiona's father. Her smile was venomous as she approached, flanked by 2 other matrons who looked equally predatory. "Your Grace," Matilda said, curtsying with exaggerated deference. "What a surprise to see you in town. And Fiona, dearest, how well you look. Country air must agree with you." The endearment was poisoned honey. "Mrs. Vale," Fiona managed, her voice admirably steady. "I must say, Your Grace, how generous you've been to take in my poor stepdaughter. After her difficulties, I worried no one would be willing to overlook her indiscretions." Matilda's voice carried perfectly to the nearby listeners. "But then, you always did have such a tender heart for strays." Julian felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. He turned to face Matilda fully, and his expression must have conveyed exactly what he thought of her performance, because her smile faltered slightly. "I find, Mrs. Vale, that the word stray is often misapplied. It suggests something lost or abandoned through its own failing." His voice was pleasant, conversational, but carved from ice, when in reality, it usually describes something precious that was deliberately discarded by someone incapable of recognizing its value. Matilda's eyes narrowed. "How poetic, Your Grace." "I prefer accurate." He placed his hand over Fiona's, where it rested on his arm, a gesture of unmistakable solidarity. "Miss Linden's presence at Ravenhall is neither charity nor temporary. She is my honored guest, and anyone who suggests otherwise will find themselves corrected. Publicly, if necessary. The threat landed like a stone in still water. Ripples of shocked whispers spread through the nearby crowd. Matilda's face went rigid. I merely meant... I'm quite certain I understood your meaning perfectly, Mrs. Vale, as I'm certain everyone else did as well. Julian's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe the next set is beginning, and I've promised Miss Linden the first dance. He steered Fiona away before Matilda could respond. Leaving the woman standing in the middle of the ballroom, her carefully constructed attack dismantled in front of the very audience she'd hoped to turn against Fiona. Julian, Fiona whispered as they reached the dance floor. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. He turned to face her, taking her hand in the proper position for the waltz. And I will do it again, as many times as necessary, until every person in this room understands that you are under my protection. Not because you need defending, but because I choose to defend you. The music began, and they swept into the dance. Fiona was a competent dancer. Her father had seen to that. But she was nervous, hyper-aware of the eyes tracking their every movement. Julian kept his focus on her, murmuring quiet reassurances, guiding her through the steps with practiced ease. They're all watching, she said. Let them watch. Let them see that I chose to dance with you first, before any of the eligible daughters they've been throwing at me for years. Let them wonder why. Why did you? The question was soft, vulnerable. Julian looked at her, really looked at her. This girl who had been kicked out onto a street corner and had somehow brought light into his carefully controlled, lonely existence. This girl who played with Scout in the gardens and laughed at his terrible jokes and made Ravenhall feel like a home instead of a mausoleum. Because somewhere between rescuing you and now, I stopped being able to imagine my life without you in it, he said quietly. And that terrifies me almost as much as it thrills me. Fiona missed a step, and he caught her smoothly, keeping them in perfect rhythm. Julian, you don't have to say anything. Not now, not here. He spun her gently through a turn. I simply wanted you to know that when I defend you, it's not obligation speaking. It's something far more dangerous. The waltz ended, and polite applause rippled through the ballroom. Julian escorted Fiona from the floor, acutely aware that they had just given society enough material for weeks of speculation. From across the room, Matilda watched them with undisguised hatred. The battle lines had been drawn, and Julian discovered, with some surprise, that he was very much looking forward to the war. My lovely family, I need to pause here for just a moment. If you're feeling what I'm feeling right now, if Julian's unwavering defense of Fiona is giving you hope that good men still exist, that protection and love are real, then please subscribe to this channel. Like and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The letter arrived at the Dowager Countess's London residence 3 days after the gala, delivered by a liveried footman who had been paid handsomely to ensure it reached her hands directly. Matilda had crafted it with surgical precision over 2 sleepless nights, detailing every sordid element of the bath incident: the private garden path, the torn clothing, the witnesses who had seen Fiona stumbling away in disarray. She had included Captain Hendrix's sworn statement, purchased for a sum that made her wince, but which would be worth every penny when it destroyed the girl's newfound security. She had even managed to obtain a letter from the Bath modiste who had repaired Fiona's dress, noting the suspicious damage to the bodice. The evidence was damning, comprehensive, and designed to leave no room for charitable interpretation. The Dowager Countess was the most influential woman in London society, a dragon in silk who could elevate a reputation with a nod or destroy it with a lifted eyebrow. If she received this information and chose to act upon it, Fiona Linden would be finished. And more importantly, the Duke of Ravenhall would be exposed as either a fool who had been deceived or a libertine harboring a woman of questionable virtue. Either way, Matilda would have her revenge. She sealed the letter with her personal stamp and smiled. Fiona learned about it from a source she never expected, Lady Ashford herself. The note arrived at Ravenhall marked urgent, and when Fiona opened it in the morning room while Julian was out riding, her hands began to tremble before she'd finished the first paragraph. Miss Linden, I write to you directly because I believe you deserve fair warning. A letter has been circulated to the Dowager Countess containing detailed allegations about your conduct in Bath 2 years past. I have reason to believe it originated from Mrs. Vale. The Dowager plans to raise the matter at the Pembroke Ball tomorrow evening, where my nephew will be in attendance. I cannot advise you on the proper course of action, but I can tell you this. If you care for Julian at all, you will consider carefully what your presence in his life may cost him. Society can forgive many things, but they will not forgive a duke who appears to have been made a fool. L. Ashford. The paper slipped from Fiona's fingers. Scout, who had been dozing at her feet, immediately stood and whined, pawing at her skirt. But Fiona couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in her ears. Matilda had done it. She'd waited until Fiona had begun to hope, begun to believe that maybe she could have this. Ravenhall, safety, Julian, and then she'd struck with the precision of an executioner. The Dowager Countess. Tomorrow evening. Public confrontation. Julian would be forced to defend her again, but this time with evidence, with signed statements, with the kind of detailed accounting that would make his defense look like willful blindness. He would be humiliated. His reputation, which he'd spent years carefully maintaining, would be shredded. All because he'd been kind to a girl crying on a curb. All because of her. The decision crystallized with painful clarity. She had to leave. Now. Before tomorrow's ball. Before Julian could sacrifice any more of himself on the altar of her damaged past. Fiona stood on shaking legs and walked mechanically to her room. Scout followed, increasingly distressed, his whines growing more insistent. She pulled out the small traveling case she'd arrived with, empty now, since Julian had provided her with everything, and began folding the few personal items she could justify taking. A spare dress. The book Julian had given her last week. The silver brush that had belonged to her mother. Her hand stilled on the brush and tears blurred her vision. She didn't want to leave. God help her. She wanted to stay in this house forever, wanted to keep having breakfast with Julian and walking in the gardens and watching Scout mediate their growing affection with his insistent little paws. She wanted the impossible. A future where her past didn't matter, where Matilda's poison couldn't reach, where she was allowed to be happy. But wanting something didn't make it right. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Scout, who was now sitting directly on her packed case, refusing to move. "I'm so sorry. But I can't let him destroy himself for me. I won't." She was penning the note to Julian, her third attempt, because the first two had been illegible through tears, when Mrs. Pembroke knocked softly on the door. "Miss Linden? His Grace has returned and is asking for you in the library." Fiona's heart plummeted. She couldn't face him. If she saw him, if he looked at her with those dark, careful eyes that had learned to soften when they found her, she would break. She would confess everything and beg him to let her stay. And he would agree because he was Julian, because he was kind, because he had somehow decided she was worth protecting, and it would ruin him. "Please tell His Grace I'm not feeling well," Fiona managed. I'll see him at dinner." Mrs. Pembroke's experienced gaze took in the traveling case, the tear-stained face, the general air of desperate flight. Her expression tightened with understanding and something that looked like disappointment. "Miss Linden," she said quietly, "whatever you're planning, I would strongly advise against it. I don't have a choice. There is always a choice, and running from the people who care for you is rarely the right one." Mrs. Pembroke stepped into the room, lowering her voice. "I've served this household for 15 years. I watched His Grace grow from a lonely young man into a lonely duke who had convinced himself that solitude was preferable to vulnerability. And then you arrived, and for the first time since I've known him, he smiled without having to remember how. Which is exactly why I have to leave," Fiona said, her voice breaking. "Before I take that away from him permanently." "You think leaving won't accomplish that just as surely?" Mrs. Pembroke shook her head. "Miss Linden, I don't know what has prompted this, but I know that the Duke values honesty above all else. If there is a threat, if something has happened, he deserves to know. He deserves the chance to face it with you, not to wake tomorrow and find you've made decisions about his life without consulting him. The decision is about my life, my past, my consequences." "Is it?" The housekeeper's tone was gentle but unyielding. "Or is it about his future too? Because from where I stand, the two have become rather entangled." Before Fiona could respond, Scout suddenly jumped from the traveling case and bolted from the room, barking urgently. Both women froze. "He's gone for the Duke," Mrs. Pembroke said with certainty. "That dog is far too clever for anyone's good." Panic flooded Fiona's chest. No, I can't. I need to leave before—" But it was too late. Scout's barking grew louder, accompanied by the sound of boots on marble. And then Julian appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, with the puppy at his heels, looking enormously proud of himself. Julian's eyes went immediately to the traveling case, to the packed belongings, to Fiona's tear-stained face. His expression shuddered. "Mrs. Pembroke," he said quietly, "please leave us." The housekeeper withdrew, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The silence that followed was devastating. "You're leaving," Julian said. It wasn't a question. Fiona couldn't meet his eyes. "I have to." "Why?" "Because Matilda sent a letter to the Dowager Countess. Detailed evidence about Bath, about the scandal. She's planning to confront you publicly tomorrow at the Pembroke ball." The words tumbled out in a rush. "Your aunt warned me. She said society won't forgive you for being made to look like a fool." And she's right, Julian. If you defend me against actual evidence, against sworn statements, you'll be destroyed. So your solution is to run away in the middle of the night like a criminal? His voice was too controlled, too careful. To make the decision for both of us, without giving me any say in the matter? I'm making the decision for you because you won't make it yourself. Fiona's voice rose, desperate. You're too good, too honorable. You'll stand beside me tomorrow night and watch your reputation burn. And you'll tell yourself it was worth it. But it won't be. I'm not worth it. Don't. The single word cracked like a whip. Julian crossed the room in 3 strides, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. Don't you dare tell me what you're worth. Don't you dare decide for me what I'm willing to sacrifice. Julian, do you know what I thought when Scout came running into the library barking like the world was ending? I thought something had happened to you. That you were hurt or frightened or in danger. And I realized, in the time it took me to run up these stairs, that there is nothing I wouldn't do to keep you safe. Not my reputation, not society's approval, not even this damn dukedom matters as much as making sure you're protected. Tears streamed down Fiona's face. You don't understand what you're saying. I understand perfectly. His grip genteened, his thumbs brushing away her tears with heartbreaking tenderness. I'm saying that I love you. I'm saying that somewhere between finding you on that curb and watching you heal in my home, you became essential. And if Matilda Vale thinks a letter full of lies and manipulated evidence will make me abandon you, she has severely underestimated both my stubbornness and my regard for you. They're not all lies, Fiona whispered. Some of it is true. I was in those gardens. I was seen. Being assaulted by a predator your stepmother deliberately sent you to. I know, you told me. And tomorrow night, the Dowager Countess and everyone else will know it too. Julian's expression hardened with determination. I am not letting you run, Fiona. I am not letting Matilda win. We face this together. Or not at all. Scout, sensing the emotional climax, barked sharply and pawed at both their legs, demanding to be included in whatever reconciliation was happening. Despite everything, Fiona laughed through her tears. He's very insistent. He knows what's right. He always has. Julian pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. Stay, please. Trust me to handle this. Trust that what we've built here is stronger than whatever poison Matilda can spread. Fiona closed her eyes, breathing in his presence, feeling the solid reality of him against her. I'm terrified. So am I, he admitted. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you. What if it doesn't work? What if tomorrow night? Then we'll face that too. Together. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. Now, unpack that ridiculous case and come down to dinner. We have plans to make. The Pembroke ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers until the entire space seemed to shimmer with anticipation. Everyone who mattered in London society had come, drawn by whispers of impending scandal, like moths to flame. Julian felt Fiona's hand tremble on his arm as they were announced. Breathe, he murmured. The same advice he'd given her at Lady Ashford's gala. But tonight was different. Tonight, they both knew exactly what awaited them. He'd spent the previous day locked in his study with his solicitor, Collins, and a private investigator he kept on retainer for delicate matters. What they'd uncovered about Matilda Vale's history had been illuminating and damning. Julian had the documents in his inner coat pocket now, insurance against whatever weapon the Dowager Countess planned to wield. But his true defense was simpler and far more dangerous to his carefully guarded heart. He was going to tell the truth, all of it. The Dowager Countess held court near the ballroom's center, a tiny woman in black silk who commanded attention through sheer force of will. She was 70 if she was a day, with eyes like chips of ice and a spine that had never bent to anyone. When those eyes landed on Julian and Fiona, her expression betrayed nothing. But a subtle gesture brought silence rippling through the nearby crowd. Your Grace, she said, her voice carrying with the precision of someone accustomed to being heard. How good of you to attend. And, Miss Linden, I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you both. Here it comes, Julian thought. The pleasure is ours, Dowager Countess, he said smoothly, refusing to release Fiona's hand, even as she tried to pull away. I've received some rather disturbing correspondence regarding your house guest. The Dowager's gaze fixed on Fiona with surgical intensity. Allegations of a serious nature, concerning her conduct in Bath. The crowd pressed closer, a predatory circle. Fiona's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin. I'm aware of what Mrs. Vale has been spreading, Your Grace. Mrs. Vale has provided documentation, sworn statements, a rather detailed accounting of an incident in Sydney Gardens involving a Captain Hendricks. The Dowager paused. She suggests that you attempted to entrap the gentleman and, when unsuccessful, created a scandal to cover your she-buy. The word hung in the air like poison. She further suggests that the Duke has been deceived as to your true character. Julian felt Fiona sway slightly beside him and tightened his grip on her hand. With respect, Dowager Countess, he said, his voice cutting through the fascinated murmurs. Mrs. Vale's version of events is not only incomplete, it is deliberately, maliciously false. You have evidence to counter sworn statements? The Dowager's eyebrow lifted. That's a serious claim, Ravenhall. I have something better than evidence. I have the truth. Julian turned to face the assembled crowd, making sure his voice reached every corner of the glittering room. 2 years ago, Miss Linden was 17 years old, recently orphaned, and under the guardianship of her stepmother, Matilda Vale. Mrs. Vale took her to Bath and deliberately arranged for Miss Linden to be placed in a compromising situation with Captain Hendricks, a man known for preying on young women without protection. Gasps rippled through the crowd. That's a lie! Matilda's voice rang out. She pushed through the crush of people, her face flushed with fury. How dare you? I dare because I have spent the past 24 hours investigating your history, Mrs. Vale, and I've discovered some fascinating details. Julian reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. Captain Hendricks was paid £500 by you 1 week before the Sydney Gardens incident. I have the bank draft. Your signature is quite distinctive. Matilda's face went white. Julian continued, relentless. I also have statements from 3 servants who worked in your Bath household. They testify that you deliberately sent your maid away the evening of the incident and that you were waiting at the garden entrance with witnesses you'd specifically invited to take the air at that exact time. This is preposterous, Matilda hissed. You would believe servants over a gentleman's sworn word? I would believe evidence over lies. And I would believe Miss Linden, who has shown me nothing but honesty and courage, over a woman who has demonstrated neither. Julian's voice hardened. You orchestrated an assault on a vulnerable girl in your care for the sole purpose of destroying her reputation. And when that didn't break her completely, when she survived 3 more years of your abuse, you cast her out with nothing but a puppy, laughing as you did it. The crowd was utterly silent now, transfixed. I was there, Julian said quietly. I saw her on that curb, broken and weeping, believing she had nowhere to go. I saw what your care had done to her, and I decided, in that moment, that I would spend whatever social capital I possessed to ensure she never felt that helpless again. He turned to the Dowager Countess, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You want to know if I've been deceived about Miss Linden's character? I haven't. I know exactly who she is. She is brave and kind and resilient. She has survived things that would have destroyed a lesser person. She reads to my staff's children when they visit. She plays with a ridiculous puppy who has annexed my favorite chair. She makes Ravenhall feel like a home instead of a museum. His voice softened. and she makes me want to be worthy of the trust she's slowly learning to place in me." Fiona was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Julian turned to her fully, taking both her hands in his, aware that he was about to commit an act of spectacular impropriety and finding he didn't care at all. "I didn't plan this," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, but speaking only to her. "I had a speech prepared about evidence and witnesses and legal proceedings. But standing here, watching Matilda try to destroy you again, I realized that the only defense that matters is the simplest one." He lowered himself to one knee. The collective gasp was audible. "Fiona Linden, I am asking you, in front of everyone who matters and several people who don't, to marry me. Not to protect you from scandal, though it will. Not to secure your position, though it will do that too. But because in the weeks you've been at Ravenhall, you've taught me what it feels like to come home to someone who's happy to see me. You've shown me that opening one's heart is terrifying and necessary and worth every risk." He smiled slightly. "And because Scout has made it abundantly clear that we belong together, and I've learned to trust his judgment." Despite her tears, Fiona laughed. "So yes, Dowager Countess," Julian said, still looking at Fiona but addressing the room. "I know exactly who I'm defending. I'm defending the woman I love. The woman I intend to make my Duchess if she'll have me. And anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." The silence was absolute. Fiona stared at him, tears streaming, her hands shaking in his. "Julian, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. Say yes, Fiona. Please." "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, her voice strengthening. "Yes." Julian stood and kissed her, propriety be damned, and the ballroom erupted. Some of the applause was genuine. Lady Ashford was clapping with undisguised satisfaction. Some was merely politic, people recognizing which way the wind was blowing and adjusting accordingly. But it didn't matter. What mattered was Fiona in his arms, kissing him back with trembling joy, and the look of utter devastation on Matilda Vale's face. The Dowager Countess rapped her cane against the floor, commanding silence. "Well," she said dryly, "that was certainly dramatic." She turned to Matilda, her expression glacial. "Mrs. Vale, I suggest you leave London. Tonight. I have no tolerance for women who prey upon children in their care, and I will make certain that every drawing room in England knows exactly what you did." "You can't," Matilda started. "I can, and I will. Get out of my sight." Matilda fled, and the crowd parted for her like water around a stone, no one willing to be associated with her downfall. The Dowager turned back to Julian and Fiona, and for the first time that evening, she smiled. "Congratulations, Ravenhall. I believe you've just created the scandal of the season." "I believe I have," Julian agreed, not caring at all. "I expect an invitation to the wedding, and I want to meet this miraculous dog who apparently orchestrated the entire affair. Scout would be honored." As the music resumed and society adjusted to its new reality, the Duke of Ravenhall engaged to a nobody, and visibly besotted besides. Julian led Fiona out onto the terrace where they could breathe. "That was insane," Fiona said, still shaking. "Completely." Julian pulled her close. "But effective. You're stuck with me now. The Dowager has given her blessing. Matilda is ruined, and I've publicly declared myself. There's no going back." "I don't want to go back." She looked up at him, wonder in her eyes. "I want to go home, to Ravenhall, to Scout, to whatever life we build together." Then that's exactly what we'll do. Inside, the ball continued, and London society would talk for months about the Duke who had knelt in a ballroom and chosen love over propriety. But on the terrace, Julian and Fiona simply held each other and planned their future, and didn't care about any of it. The carriage ride back to Ravenhall passed in a blur of silence and stolen glances. Fiona sat across from Julian, her mind spinning through the events of the evening. The Dowager's confrontation, Matilda's humiliation, and most of all, Julian kneeling before her in front of all of London society, proposing marriage as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if she were worth such a gesture. The doubt crept in slowly, insidiously, filling the spaces between her racing heartbeats. He had said he loved her. He had defended her beautifully, completely. But he had also been backed into a corner, forced to choose between his reputation and her ruin. What if the proposal had been strategy rather than desire? What if he'd simply chosen the least damaging option available? What if she had trapped him just as surely as Matilda had tried to trap her in Sydney Gardens? Julian seemed to sense her spiraling thoughts. "You're thinking too loudly," he said gently. "I'm just processing." "Fiona." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, closing the distance between them. "Whatever you're processing, process it out loud. Please." She couldn't meet his eyes. "You proposed to save me from scandal. I proposed because I wanted to marry you. But if Matilda hadn't forced your hand, if the Dowager hadn't confronted us, would you have asked at all?" The words tumbled out, raw and frightened. "Or would we have continued on as we were, with me as your permanent house guest, safe but separate, because that would have been easier than risking." "Stop!" Julian moved across the carriage to sit beside her, taking her hand. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly. "I had the ring made 3 days ago," he said quietly. Fiona's breath caught. "What?" "Before Matilda's letter. Before Lady Ashford's warning. Before any of tonight's drama." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I've been carrying it around, trying to find the right moment, the right words. Trying to convince myself that you might actually say yes to a man who lives in his own head too much and has conversations with a dog like it's his closest confidant." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, a sapphire the color of twilight, surrounded by small diamonds, set in silver. Simple, elegant, perfect. "It's the same color as the dress you wore to Lady Ashford's gala," Julian said. "The modiste kept a swatch, and I brought it to the jeweler. I wanted something that would remind you of the first time you walked into society on my arm and refused to be ashamed of who you are." Fiona's vision blurred with tears. "Julian, tonight wasn't about strategy, Fiona. Tonight was about refusing to let Matilda take one more thing from you. Yes, I proposed publicly. Yes, it will silence the gossip. But I would have proposed anyway, probably in the library with Scout as witness, stumbling over my words and hoping desperately that you felt even a fraction of what I feel for you." "I don't understand how you can feel anything for me at all," she whispered. "I came with nothing. I am nothing." "You came with a puppy and more courage than anyone I've ever met." Julian's voice was fierce now, insistent. "Do you know what I saw that night on the curb? I saw someone who had lost everything and was still holding on to the one creature that depended on her. You could have abandoned Scout. He would have slowed you down, made finding shelter harder. But you didn't. You clutched him tighter. You chose love over survival." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "And then you came to Ravenhall. And instead of becoming bitter or demanding or entitled, you healed. You read to children. You learned the names of every servant in the household. You sat with Mrs. Pembroke when her sister was ill and kept her company through the night. You made my empty house feel full, Fiona. Not with noise or drama, but with kindness, with warmth, with the kind of gentle presence I didn't know I was starving for. I just wanted to be useful, she said, her voice breaking, to earn my place. You don't have to earn anything. You belong at Ravenhall because I cannot imagine it without you anymore. You belong in my life because you've made me want things I thought I'd given up on. Companionship, partnership, a future that doesn't look like endless identical days stretching into oblivion. The carriage rolled through the gates of Ravenhall, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath the wheels. Scout brought you to me, Julian continued softly. That's true. But you're the one who made me want to keep you. Not out of duty or obligation or strategy, but because when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think is that I hope you'll be in the breakfast room. Because when I'm reading in the library, I listen for your footsteps. Because when something amusing happens, you're the person I want to tell. He pressed his forehead against hers. So please stop trying to convince yourself that I proposed out of necessity. I proposed because I love you. Because I want to spend the rest of my life watching you be kind to people who don't deserve it and teaching Scout terrible habits and making me laugh when I least expect it. I'm terrified, Fiona admitted. I'm terrified that I'll wake up and this will all have been a dream. That I'll be back on that curb with nowhere to go. Then I'll spend every day, for the rest of our lives, proving to you that it's real. That you're safe. That you're loved. He pulled back just enough to look at her. Will you let me try? The carriage stopped before the entrance, but neither of them moved. Fiona looked at this man, this duke who had knelt in a ballroom for her, who carried a ring he'd had made before scandal forced his hand, who spoke of her kindness as if it were something precious instead of expected. I love you, she said, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. I think I started loving you the moment you let Scout lead you to me, when you looked at me like I was a person worth helping instead of a problem to be solved. Julian's expression transformed, wonder and relief and joy breaking through his usual reserve. Say it again. I love you, Julian Ashford. And yes, I'll marry you. Not because society expects it, or because it's practical, or because it saves us both from scandal. She smiled through her tears. But because the thought of leaving Ravenhall, of leaving you, made me feel like I was losing my home all over again. He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly. And when they finally broke apart, both breathless, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The carriage door opened, and there was Scout, having somehow escaped from the house, barking joyfully and dancing in circles at their feet. Mrs. Pembroke stood on the steps behind him, trying and failing to look stern. He's been howling at the door since you left, she called. Utterly inconsolable. I thought it best to let him greet you properly. Julian descended from the carriage and immediately scooped up the puppy, who proceeded to lick his face with enthusiastic abandon. Yes, we're home, and we have news. He offered his free hand to Fiona, who took it and stepped down into the torchlight. Mrs. Pembroke, Julian announced, you'll need to begin preparations for a wedding. Miss Linden has agreed to make an honest man of me. The housekeeper's stern expression cracked into a genuine smile. About time, Your Grace. I'll inform the staff. They've all been hoping for precisely this outcome. Have they? Fiona asked, surprised. My dear, the entire household has been watching the two of you dance around each other for weeks. We've had a betting pool going on when His Grace would finally work up the courage to propose. She looked at Julian with fond exasperation. Though I must say, doing it in the middle of the Pembroke ballroom was rather more dramatic than any of us anticipated. Julian had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. It seemed like the moment. It was perfect, Fiona said softly, squeezing his hand. They walked into Ravenhall together, Scout trotting between them, and for the first time since her father's death, Fiona felt the bone-deep certainty of belonging. Later, after Mrs. Pembroke had bustled off to wake the cook for a celebratory late supper, and Scout had finally exhausted himself and fallen asleep on his chair, Julian and Fiona stood together in the library, watching the fire burn low. No more doubts? Julian asked, his arms around her waist, her back against his chest. Oh, I'll have doubts, Fiona admitted. I'll probably have them for a while. Years of Matilda's voice in my head won't disappear overnight. Then I'll just have to be louder than Matilda's voice. He pressed a kiss to her temple. I can be very persistent when properly motivated. I've noticed. She turned in his arms to face him. Thank you for fighting for me tonight. For fighting for us. Thank you for staying. For trusting me enough to stay. Scout snored loudly from his chair, one paw twitching in a dream. He's going to be insufferable now, Fiona observed. He'll think he orchestrated the entire thing. He did orchestrate the entire thing, Julian said, and he absolutely deserves to be insufferable about it. Fiona laughed, the sound echoing through the library, filling the spaces that had been silent for too long. Outside, London was already buzzing with the scandal of the Duke's dramatic proposal. Letters were being written, opinions formed, sides chosen. But inside Ravenhall, none of it mattered. Inside Ravenhall, three souls who had all been lonely in their own ways had found exactly what they needed: each other, a home, and the certainty that love, real, honest, courageous love, was worth every risk. The wedding preparations transformed Ravenhall into a hive of purposeful chaos. Mrs. Pembroke commanded the household staff with military precision, overseeing everything from flower arrangements to the menu for the wedding breakfast. The modiste arrived daily with new samples and adjustments, turning Fiona's fitting sessions into lengthy affairs that Scout attended with great interest, occasionally absconding with ribbons and lace scraps that had to be retrieved from under furniture. Julian had wanted a large society wedding, not for show, but because he wanted everyone who had whispered about Fiona to watch her become a duchess. But Fiona had quietly asked for something smaller, more intimate, and he'd agreed immediately. The ceremony would be held in Ravenhall's chapel, with only close friends and trusted staff in attendance. I don't need to prove anything to society anymore, Fiona had explained, standing in the garden where Scout was attempting to dig up the roses. I just need to marry you. Julian had kissed her then, in full view of 3 gardeners and the scandalized under-butler, and declared it the best decision he'd never made. The letter arrived 1 week before the wedding. Fiona recognized the handwriting immediately, sharp, angular script that had once made her hands shake whenever she saw it on her father's correspondence. Now it just made her tired. She opened it in the morning room, Julian reading his own correspondence across from her, Scout dozing between them in a patch of sunlight. You think you've won, but you're merely postponing the inevitable. The Duke will tire of you once the novelty wears off. He'll see you for what you truly are, a manipulative, grasping creature who trapped him with tears and a convenient puppy. I will make certain everyone knows the truth. I will spend every day for the rest of my life ensuring you never forget what you are. Worthless, damaged, undeserving of the Ashford name. You may have fooled him temporarily, but blood tells, Fiona. Your mother was weak, and so are you. When he casts you out, and he will, don't come crawling back to me. The letter went on for 2 more pages, each paragraph more venomous than the last, detailing every perceived slight, every imagined manipulation, every way in which Fiona had supposedly destroyed Matilda's life by simply existing. Fiona read it twice, waiting for the familiar panic to set in. Waiting for Matilda's poison to find its mark, to make her doubt, to make her feel small and unworthy. It didn't come. Instead, she felt something else entirely. Pity. Fiona? Julian had set down his own letter, watching her with concern. What is it? She handed him Matilda's letter without a word. His expression darkened with each line, the muscle in his jaw tightening. When he finished, he set the pages down with careful precision, as if afraid he might tear them apart otherwise. I'm calling my solicitor, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. This constitutes harassment. We can pursue legal action. No. Fiona surprised herself with the firmness of her own voice. Not legal action, not a dramatic confrontation, just a boundary. Julian studied her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Matilda wants a reaction. She wants me afraid, wants me doubting myself, wants me to give her power over my happiness even now. Fiona looked down at the letter, at the desperate venom in every word. But I'm not afraid anymore. I'm just done. She stood and crossed to Julian's desk, pulling out a sheet of his personal stationery. Scout, sensing something important was happening, trotted over to supervise. May I? She asked, gesturing to the pen and ink. Of course. Fiona wrote carefully, her hand steady. Mrs. Vale, this will be the last communication between us. Any further letters, visits, or attempts at contact will be referred directly to the Duke's solicitor and pursued as harassment under the law. You spent 3 years trying to convince me I was worthless. You failed. I am marrying a man who sees my value clearly, who chose me freely, and who has shown me what family actually means. I forgive you for what you did to me, not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. I will not carry your bitterness into my marriage or my future. Do not contact me again. Fiona Linden, soon to be Fiona Ashford, Duchess of Ravenhall. She signed it with a flourish, blotted the ink, and sealed it before she could second-guess herself. Julian had read over her shoulder, and when she turned to look at him, there was something like awe in his expression. That, he said quietly, is perfect. Is it too harsh? Too lenient? I can rewrite. He pulled her into his arms, cutting off her spiral of doubt. It's exactly right. You're not engaging with her poison. You're simply closing a door that should have been closed years ago. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. I'm proud of you. I had a good teacher, Fiona said, thinking of all the times Julian had defended her, not with cruelty or vengeance, but with simple, immovable certainty. You showed me that I don't have to fight every battle. Sometimes it's enough to just walk away. Collins will ensure it's delivered, Julian said, along with a formal legal notice that any further contact will result in action. She'll understand we're serious. Scout barked his approval, then immediately returned to his important work of napping in the sunlight. The letter was sent that afternoon. Matilda's response never came. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the autumn sun turning Ravenhall's gardens into a tapestry of gold and amber. The chapel had been decorated simply, white roses and ivy, candles in the windows, the ancient stones warmed by light and love. Fiona stood in the rose room, staring at her reflection and barely recognizing herself. The wedding dress was ivory silk, simply cut but exquisitely made, with delicate embroidery at the bodice and sleeves. Her hair had been dressed with pearl pins, her mother's, saved all these years in Mrs. Pembroke's safekeeping and returned to her just that morning with tears in the housekeeper's eyes. "Your mother would be so proud," Mrs. Pembroke said, adjusting the small veil. "Your father, too." "I wish they could be here," Fiona whispered. "They are, dear. In every good choice you've made, every kind word you've spoken, every moment of courage you've shown. They're here." A scratch at the door announced Scout's arrival. He'd been bathed and brushed within an inch of his life and wore a small ivory bow tied to his collar. He took one look at Fiona and barked, tail wagging so hard his entire body shook. "I think that's approval," Mrs. Pembroke said with a smile. "Shall we? His Grace is waiting, and between you and me, he's been pacing the chapel for the past hour." The walk to the chapel was short, but felt momentous. The staff lined the hallway, beaming at her with genuine affection. Cook was crying openly. The gardeners had apparently abandoned their posts to watch from the windows. Lady Ashford waited at the chapel entrance, serving as Fiona's attendant despite the unconventionality of it. "You look beautiful," Julian's aunt said, her usual sharpness softened by something that might have been affection. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad my nephew finally found someone who sees past the title to the man underneath." "Thank you for warning me about Matilda's letter," Fiona said quietly. "You gave me the chance to choose this, instead of having it chosen for me." "Well, I couldn't let that harridan win, could I? Where would be the fun in that?" Lady Ashford smiled. "Now come on. Julian looks like he's about to wear a hole in the chapel floor." The doors opened, and Fiona saw him. Julian stood at the altar in formal dress, his dark eyes fixed on the doorway with an intensity that made her breath catch. When he saw her, his entire expression transformed, wonder and joy, and something so tender, it made her heart ache. Scout, deciding the pace was far too slow, broke free from Mrs. Pembroke's hold and bounded down the aisle, barking joyfully. He skidded to a stop at Julian's feet, looking enormously pleased with himself for once again bringing his two favorite people together. The small gathering laughed, and the last of Fiona's nerves dissolved. This was right. This was home. She walked down the aisle, no one to give her away, because she was giving herself freely, and placed her hand in Julian's. "Hello," he said softly, just for her. "Hello," she replied, smiling through happy tears. The ceremony was simple and perfect. The vicar spoke of love and partnership and the sacred bond of marriage. Julian's responses were steady and sure. Fiona's voice shook only slightly when she promised to love and cherish him for all her days. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Julian kissed her with such tenderness that several people in the small congregation openly wept. Scout barked his approval, and the chapel filled with laughter and applause. The wedding breakfast was held in Ravenhall's dining room, intimate and joyful. Toasts were made. Cook's elaborate cake was devoured. Scout stationed himself under the table, collecting dropped treats with the efficiency of a seasoned veteran. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Julian pulled Fiona into the garden for a moment of quiet. "How are you?" he asked, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. "Truly?" "Happy," Fiona said, and realized it was completely true. Matilda sent that horrible letter, and I thought it would ruin everything. But instead, it just ended. I'm free of her, Julian. Actually free. "You were always free," he said. "You just needed time to believe it." "I believe it now." She looked up at her husband, and smiled. "I believe in us, in this, in forever." "Good," Julian said, pulling her closer. "Because I intend to spend every day of that forever, making sure you never doubt it again." Scout appeared from the bushes, muddy and delighted, carrying what appeared to be someone's garden glove in his mouth. "Our family," Fiona observed, laughing as the puppy dropped the glove at their feet like a prize. "Our perfect, slightly ridiculous family," Julian agreed, scooping up Scout before he could disappear to find more contraband. That evening, as the last guests departed and Ravenhall settled into peaceful quiet, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenhall sat together in the library, Scout asleep across both their laps. Matilda's letter had been consigned to the fire, its ashes scattered and forgotten. In its place was something infinitely more powerful, a future built on love, trust, and the unshakable certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged. Together. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and spring had come to Ravenhall with extravagant enthusiasm. Fiona sat in the garden on a blanket spread beneath an old oak tree, a book open in her lap that she hadn't turned a page of in 20 minutes. The afternoon sun filtered through new leaves, dappling everything in gold and green, and somewhere nearby, a thrush was singing its heart out. Scout had grown considerably since that night on the curb, no longer a trembling puppy, but a confident young dog who ruled Ravenhall with benevolent authority. At the moment, he was engaged in mortal combat with a stick roughly twice his size, growling ferociously as he dragged it across the lawn. "He's going to destroy the roses again," Julian observed, settling onto the blanket beside her. He'd abandoned his jacket somewhere and rolled up his shirt sleeves, his dark hair slightly mussed from the wind. He looked younger like this, more relaxed, the careful ducal reserve he wore in society completely absent. "Mrs. Pembroke will forgive him," Fiona said, leaning against Julian's shoulder. "She always does. I found her slipping him bacon at breakfast yesterday. She claims he's too thin. He's not remotely thin. He's getting positively portly from all the treats everyone sneaks him." As if sensing he was being discussed, Scout abandoned his stick and trotted over, climbing onto the blanket and settling himself directly between them with a satisfied huff. His tail thumped against Fiona's leg, and she scratched behind his ears automatically. "Do you remember what you said that first night?" Julian asked, running his hand along Scout's back. "In the carriage, when I brought you here. I said a lot of things. Most of them involved apologizing and trying to convince you I wasn't worth the trouble. You asked what I expected in return for my kindness." Julian's fingers found hers, threading together naturally. "Do you still wonder that?" Fiona was quiet for a moment, watching Scout's eyes drift closed in contentment. "No," she said softly. "I think I finally understand that you never expected anything at all. That was the point. And yet, I gained everything." She turned to look at him, finding him already watching her with that expression that still made her breath catch. The one that said he saw her completely and loved what he found. "I've been thinking about that night," Fiona admitted. "The one where Matilda kicked me out. I used to have nightmares about it, about sitting on that curb, feeling like my entire world had ended. But lately, the dreams have changed. How so? Now when I dream about it, I'm not afraid anymore, because I know how it ends. She smiled. I know that the carriage stops, that Scout runs to you, that you follow him back to me, and everything changes. Julian pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. Everything changed for me too. I just didn't realize how much until you were here, making this enormous house feel like it was finally the right size. Scout snored gently between them, utterly content in his role as bridge between two souls who had needed each other without knowing it. Collins told me something interesting yesterday, Julian said. Apparently Matilda left England. She's gone to stay with a distant cousin in Scotland, indefinitely. Fiona absorbed this information, waiting for the old fear to spike, for the worry that Matilda would return to try once more to destroy her happiness. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt only a distant, detached pity for a woman who had chosen bitterness over growth, cruelty over compassion. Good, she said simply. I hope she finds whatever it is she's looking for, though I suspect what she's looking for doesn't actually exist. What do you mean? She wanted power over me, control, the ability to make me feel as small and worthless as she felt inside. Fiona looked around the gardens, at the home she'd come to love, at the man beside her who had shown her what partnership truly meant. But you can't control love, Julian. You can't diminish it or destroy it through cruelty. It just grows anyway, despite everything working against it. Like a very determined puppy, Julian observed. Exactly like a very determined puppy. She laughed. Scout saved my life, you know, in every way that matters. He saved mine too, Julian said quietly. I was so convinced that solitude was safer than vulnerability, that keeping everyone at arm's length meant I couldn't be hurt or disappointed. And then this ridiculous creature led me to you, and I realized I'd been living half a life. And now I wake up every morning and my first thought is gratitude that you're here, that you chose this, that you chose me. Fiona shifted to face him fully, careful not to disturb the sleeping Scout. Julian Ashford, I would choose you every single day for the rest of my life. In every version of this story, in every possible outcome, I would always choose you. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, the kind of kiss that spoke of forever rather than passion, of coming home rather than chasing excitement. When they broke apart, Scout cracked one eye open, assessed that nothing interesting was happening, and went back to sleep. He's such a romantic, Fiona said dryly. He's already brought us together. The rest is our responsibility. Julian stood, offering his hand. Walk with me. There's something I want to show you. She took his hand, and Scout immediately woke and bounded after them, tail wagging, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Julian led her through the gardens to a section she rarely visited, the old family cemetery where generations of Ashfords rested beneath weathered headstones and ancient yew trees. I've been meaning to bring you here, Julian said, stopping before two new stones, simple and elegant, with fresh flowers planted around their bases. I had them moved from the churchyard in town. I thought they should be here, at Ravenhall, with us. Fiona's breath caught as she read the inscriptions. Thomas Linden, beloved Father Margaret Linden, beloved mother and wife. Julian, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You brought them home. They're part of your story, which means they're part of our story now. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. I want our children to know about their grandfather. who taught his daughter to recognize bird calls, and their grandmother, who loved deeply enough to be remembered with such devotion. I want them here, Fiona. Part of our family. She turned in his arms, holding him tightly, overwhelmed by the simple, profound kindness of the gesture. Thank you, she managed through her tears. Thank you for understanding how much this means. They stood there for a long time, Scout sitting quietly at their feet, as if he too understood the sacredness of the moment. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward evening, they walked back to the house together, their hands intertwined, Scout trotting ahead to investigate every interesting smell. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Scout hadn't run to my carriage that night? Julian asked. If he'd been too frightened or too well behaved? I try not to, Fiona admitted. It's too terrifying to imagine. I think about it sometimes, and I realize that the entire trajectory of my life changed because a puppy decided I was trustworthy. He smiled. Best decision anyone ever made on my behalf. Scout has excellent judgment. He does indeed. They reached the terrace, where Mrs. Pembroke was directing footmen in preparing for dinner. She spotted them and smiled, the expression transforming her usually stern features into something warm and grandmotherly. Your Graces, dinner in an hour, if that suits. Perfect, Mrs. Pembroke, Julian said. We'll be in the library. But instead of going inside, Fiona paused, turning to look back at the gardens spread out before them. The roses beginning to bloom, the carefully tended paths, the ancient oak where they'd sat earlier, and beyond it all, the gentle hills of the estate rolling toward the horizon. What is it? Julian asked. I was just thinking about inheritance, Fiona said softly. When my father died, Matilda made sure I understood that I would inherit nothing. No money, no property, no security. Just Scout, and she even tried to take that away from me. And instead, you inherited all of this. Julian gestured to Ravenhall. No, Fiona corrected, turning to face him. I inherited something far more valuable than property, or titles, or wealth. She took both his hands in hers. I inherited the knowledge that I'm worthy of love. That kindness isn't transactional. That home isn't a place. It's the people who choose to build it with you. Julian's expression softened impossibly further. You've given me the same inheritance, you know. The courage to be vulnerable. The joy of being known completely. The certainty that I'm loved for who I am, not what I possess. Scout barked, reminding them that he was also part of this equation and deserved recognition for his role in bringing them together. And you? Fiona said, scooping up the dog and laughing as he licked her face. Gave us both the gift of intervention at exactly the right moment. We owe you everything, you ridiculous, wonderful creature. Scout wagged his tail, entirely satisfied with this assessment of his importance. As the three of them finally went inside, the Duke, the Duchess, and the dog who had saved them both, the evening light painted Ravenhall in shades of gold and amber, turning the great house into something that looked almost like magic. And perhaps it was magic, Fiona thought. The magic of compassion meeting desperation, of love recognizing itself across the distance of loneliness, of a small, brave puppy understanding something that two damaged humans had forgotten. That sometimes salvation comes not from grand gestures or perfect plans, but from the simple act of leading someone to exactly where they're meant to be. Years later, when their children asked how Papa and Mama met, Fiona would tell them about the worst night of her life that became the doorway to her best life. She would tell them about a stepmother's cruelty and a duke's kindness, and a puppy who refused to accept that broken things couldn't be mended. But that was still to come. For now, in this perfect moment, Fiona simply walked into Ravenhall with her husband and her dog, grateful beyond measure for the inheritance that truly mattered. Love freely given, courage hard won, and the unshakable knowledge that she was finally, completely, eternally home. And that, my beautiful family, is how a puppy, a duke, and a displaced girl became a family. If this story moved you, if you smiled when Scout ran to Julian, if you cried when Julian proposed, if you felt that warmth in your chest when Fiona finally came home, then I'm begging you, don't keep it to yourself. Click that share button. Send it to someone who needs to believe in second chances. Send it to someone who's sitting on their own curb right now, feeling forgotten. Your share might be exactly what they need today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? I create these stories for you, stories of hope, redemption, and love that doesn't give up. But I can only keep making them if you tell me you want more. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and become part of this family that believes compassion is stronger than cruelty, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us leads us exactly where we're meant to be. Drop a comment and tell me, are you Team Julian, Team Fiona, or Team Scout? I read every single one, and your words fuel my creativity. Until next time, remember, your carriage might be coming. Your rescue might be closer than you think. Don't give up. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team. I will see you in the next story.